Hello and well met, everyone. This is Founder Laren. I am here with Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today we're going to talk about some line of sight and lighting topics. These are in answer to a lot of different confusion, and I think a lot of different users have different ideas, misconceptions, or even maybe even some bad habits. So but I want to go over some preliminary things first. So we got the 5th edition rule set here, but this could hold true of almost any rule set that takes advantage of the line of sight and lighting tools. It also assumes that you have some form of license and that you are the host. So if you're a player, this may or may not help you directly, but it will give you some idea of what the game master and the host has to go through, and also give you some tips on moving tokens and such. So, without further ado, over here in the combat tracker, I have 3 characters. I kept it at a minimum, that way it's not too complex and take too much time. So I have Watch Commander Cornwell, he's a fighter. I have Dorig, who is, in this case, sometimes I play him as a cleric, but in this case he's also a fighter. And then I also have Hiena, who is a 3rd level cleric. So these are all 3rd level characters. Once they're created, they go onto the combat tracker. The next thing is this map. This is a custom map that I downloaded from Angela's Maps. She creates virtual tabletop maps. This is a Fantasy Grounds module that she created. It already had some of the line of sight in place, but I'm going to use this as an example of what and what not to do for Fantasy Grounds, or at least their suggestions. And then I have some notes here that I'm going to go over that might help you think about Fantasy Grounds and how you want to wrap your mind around some of these elements. So as a game master, you have a lot of moving pieces, but some of the basic things that you need to remember about using the map tools is that you make it as complex as you want. So technically, you don't even have to use the map tools the way it was designed. If you just have a grid on the map, that in itself will take care of like half of what you need to do with Fantasy Grounds. But if you want to take advantage of shadows and blocking light and special effects and all that, then you will eventually have to get used to how to use the tools. So I'm not really going to make this a tutorial on how to set up the line of sight, but I am going to cover some of the elements of it. That way, if you go to edit or change anything in your game, you have an idea where to look. So I think one of the misconceptions that people have on the maps themselves, or at least a misunderstanding of, is how lighting and how the combat tracker and the map and the tool works together. And that's the thing I want to focus on the most. So it's not so much a tutorial on how to set up the line of sight. We're going to assume that you already have line of sight, or maybe you just want to modify things a little bit. That's generally what most people do. When you are setting up a complete map from scratch, that is a whole different show. That would require focusing on different aspects of the map tools more in depth. What I want to more cover is the usage. And I think this is where a lot of people that are new, or people that have only been using the platform for a little while, get a little bit confused and lost. So we're going to talk about the limitations of senses, the lack of sources, your length of stay or level of service the map is going to give you, and also to lean on some support when you need it. So that's kind of what this is about. So line of sight doesn't just mean line of sight. It could mean a lot of different things for me anyways. So those are the things we want to use that acronym for. So limitation of senses would come down to, sight is not the only sense that you rely on in a given scenario. So a lot of times, 90% of the time, people rely on vision. If you do theater of the mind, or if you're in a situation where it's almost completely pitch black and you don't have any light sources, that's where sight, smell, and other senses come into play. So you don't always have to rely on a visual component of a map. It is nice to have a map, but you don't have to have one. The next thing is lack of sources. So if you have a map and it is a full colored virtual tabletop map like I have, you don't necessarily have to have line of sight enabled or any of the functionality that comes with the tool itself. If you actually unlock the map, stick a grid on it by clicking on the grid tool, and then turning on the visibility, that in itself is huge. And then you can adjust the size if you want. So this is 102 0.4, so it's kind of got a weird dimension, but that's because it's divided evenly, the way the person who created this. And then if you look closely, you can see that it is slightly off. So if you really wanted to, you can nudge this over just a hair with these smaller arrows. So I might move it just a hair over and then relock it into place. So this is the layer for the actual map. This is the swamp with a grid already painted on it. So once you've changed or modified whatever it is, see, if you use the arrow, the larger arrow, it moves it over too much. But if you use the smaller arrows, this is in pixels, so it's going to just slightly move it over. So I just recentered it ever so slightly. That kind of helps recenter it. The other thing is visibility. So right now I can't see the grid as well. Maybe I want it to stand out more. Maybe I want it less. It's kind of hard to do when you already have a layer painted on there. But I'm going to go ahead and click on the tint button. And this will give me the ability to change the color. So I'm going to go with this kind of this yellowish color, which will stand out a little bit brighter. And then you can change the alpha, so you can change the intensity and the brightness or the opacity. So I'm going to put it probably about in the middle, and then I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So that just changed the dynamic of the vision when it comes to the actual grid. Some people like it brighter, some people like it darker. It just depends on your situation. So that helps just in itself. That's really helpful. Now, if you want to use the map just like you used to back in the day when you had no line of sight, like classic or whatnot, you can still use the universal mask, which is this mask symbol on the very top. So if you click on that and then you add a global mask, it's going to cover this whole map for your players and for you. And then at this point, you might have a starting area. So I'm going to line out this area here by going to play mode. And then I'm going to click on the map and just use this to line out whatever I want to use for in this case, I'm going to reveal just an area. So I'm in the map mask tool. Here is the reveal area tool. I'm just going to go like that, and this will unmask that area. So depending on how you want to handle this, you can unmask areas. You can also switch over and cover it back up. So if you just want to play with Fog of War or something like that, you can. And if you want to draw lines that are not square, just hold down the Alt key and trace around. And that gives you the ability to create an uneven shape. If you want to do it this way, that's a good way to create an uneven shape, just holding down the Control key. So if that's something that you're interested in and you just want to run your game like that, that's probably the simplest way to do it without having any sort of way to have it so that you have a bunch of complications. So this is kind of like running it the old way before when we had Classic. Then that's probably the simplest way. If you don't want to run it this way, you want to actually use the line of sight tools. You don't necessarily need this particular mask unless you want to combine it with the line of sight tools, but this can actually kind of confuse you if you have both. So if you want to remove the mask, the global mask, just click on disable and that gets rid of it. So that's the easiest way. Just have a grid, use the universal mask. That's really simple. And then you just reveal it as you go. So that's one way you can utilize the maps and make it very simple, and you don't have to turn on and off different things, and you're not, looking for stuff. That's really simple to do. Once you have the map grid on, you want to lock that layer if it isn't already. There is also a effect on here for the water. So if you go to the line of sight tool, and if you zoom in carefully, you can turn on the visibility of this effect. And you can create this effect if you so desire. It looks to me like this was turned on, but it's not as active as you would think because it's turned down quite a bit. But if you turn up the settings a little, you can see the movement. And whoever created this map, I think this is Angela's work, she had already set this particular water to kind of make a little bit of a movement when you're on the map to kind of give it that realism. And I think at the time she made this, there wasn't the blurring tool. You can turn that on to kind of make the edges blend into your map, so it's not so obvious. So this is something that you might turn on or off depending on how you want to do this. But I would just kind of have it on as kind of more of an immersive thing. You don't have to have moving water. You can leave it as it is, but it kind of gives you that illusion that the water is moving. And in a swamp area, I don't know if it would necessarily be moving that fast. It might even be very stagnant, so keeping it lower might make more sense. So that's just an effects layer that was added to this map. You don't have to have that level of detail, but that's there. And once you have it set, you can lock that as well. And then the next layer here is the line of sight layer. So I'm going to lock that for now. But what this does is it lines out the trees and the terrain. So as you can see, Angela's already put the actual line of sight on the map. On these trees, I think these are a little bit, for my personal opinion, I don't think they need as many points. And I would only use the points towards the center of the tree. That way, when you come close to the tree, you can still see some of the branches. So this is a little bit much for what is required for here. So I would have moved all this in a little bit. I don't think I would have necessarily made this one huge blob here, because when you actually have a token on the map, they're not going to see much of that tree because it's covered. Same with this. This is obviously made before Fantasy Grounds was fully tested, or when it's still in work now. But what I think would be a good idea here is to reduce the number of points, and you can do that now with the actual tool. So if you have a map that has a ton of these little points on it, this is a little bit excessive. Like all these little dots in here, that's a little much. You don't really need that many points, and that's one of the things that'll give you a performance hit. And like this here, this is kind of a, I wouldn't say lazy, but this is kind of an ugly way to put a tree stump in here. So I would change some of this if this was my map, and if I wanted to make this a little bit more digestible for the players when they come on the map. Because what you're going to have is it's going to look like a column instead of a tree. So these are just different little aesthetic things that you can change if you want. I don't want to do too much of this, but I'm going to click on one of these points with the selection mode. I'm just going to drag these in a little and make this look more natural instead of just one big circle. I don't think that's serving the purpose of this line of sight for the tree very well. It kind of gives it more of a natural look if you don't have all these different elements bunched up together like a column, because then it doesn't give you the natural feel. So it's kind of a way that I think some people get too carried away with line of sight, and they just think that they need to have it on every single thing, and it's not true. Matter of fact, all this stuff is unnecessary, but if you want to leave it and you want to kind of uncomplicate it or make it a little less data points, you just click on any one of the points in here along this line, and there is a setting called Remove Selected Points, or in this case, we're going to use Simplify Selected Occluders. So if you double click and it selects all these points here, you can click this down arrow, and what it does is it removes some of the redundant and unnecessary points. So that's already cleaned up quite a few points right there. And you would go along and do this on maps that are very complex, that have way too many dots in them. You can't do it on everything, and you certainly don't want to wreck your line of sight. But like this here, I do the same thing. So I'm just going to double click on one of the points, and that selects all the lines that are in this structure. And then click the down arrow, and that's going to simplify the points. It's already removed like a third of the points, and that's what you want. You don't want it to remove too many. You don't do it 2 or 3 times. You just do it like once or twice. Same thing with this structure up here. Double click, and when I click the Simplify Occluder, it actually removes half of those, which will help increase your performance around the table. And the same thing with this hut. This is the rooftop here. She probably made this with the ellipse tool, which is fine. This is pretty much like a circle, but I think there's way too many points in small area. So again, just double click on the shape and then use the down arrow, and it will get rid of half of those. So that's kind of the way how you make these maps a little simpler and a lot less data points, so that it doesn't take a performance hit on your computer. And you don't need to have these calculated when they're so close together. I mean, look at those. Those are all really close. So if I double click on it, click on Simplify Occluders, that is going to take away quite a few of those points without destroying the map too much. And you might do it once or twice, but if you do it more than that, then you're going to potentially take away some of the features of the map. So there's ways to clean up the map so it's not so extensive or so excessive with your data points. So if you have a big, huge map that hasn't been optimized for Fantasy Grounds, that's the way you can do it. Or if you made a map long ago and you have 50,000 points on it, that's a way to reduce that number fairly quickly. Like I said, you only need to go do it once or twice. Otherwise, it's going to cause problems and create things. Yeah, that Simplify tool is something that does make things nice. SmiteWorks realized halfway through the game that they had way too many data points on a lot of the maps that were created by the community. So you got to remember they sourced out some of that work. And in the early iterations of Fantasy Grounds, they made it to where it was tough to where they didn't realize how much of an impact that was going to have on people's computers. So the Simplify tool is a nice and easy way to help simplify or create less points in a given map, and that will cut down on your lagginess and your performance. So another thing is like these trees here. These are like ovals. They're perfect shapes. I wouldn't have anything like that on trees. Maybe on a column or a pillar or something, but on a tree, again, I would just have points that are kind of random, or they kind of follow the structure of the stump in the center. That kind of gives this more of a natural look, and it doesn't look so clinical or so crazy looking. So maybe I would put these points out where the branches are coming out from the stump. Maybe move this one in, move that out. So this is kind of the kind of details and the kind of things that most people don't care about or they're not sure about when they first start using Fantasy Grounds. But I'm kind of picky like that. But this is something that does bother me when I'm using a map. Like this thing here, I would totally scrap this whole thing here. So if you double click on one of the points, that'll select all the points in the line. Just hit delete, and that deletes the whole thing. Then I'm going to make sure that I'm in the line of sight tool, and I'm going to go to terrain, and I'm just going to go to the line tool, because whoever did this before obviously just went around the very edge. I think the easiest way to do this is just kind of follow the contour of the branches that are coming off the main trunk. And that's probably all you need right there. Because when you come up to this as a player and you don't have line of sight and all that stuff figured out, it's going to look like a huge blob when really it's just the tree itself and some of the bigger branches that are going to block vision. It's not the whole tree. I mean, that's a little much unless that tree is a bush and the branches go all the way down to the ground. I mean, it doesn't make sense. So I think just having a little bit of line of sight on something like that, especially a scraggly swamp tree like this, there's no reason why you would have all these points on such a scraggly looking thing anyway. So these don't have that many branches or I should say leaves. So that's just something you want to keep in mind when you're putting line of sight on. Don't overkill the whole thing. I mean, some of this stuff is overkill. Like this probably okay, but I'll leave that for now. I don't want to spend hours doing this. But like this thing here is an octagon. Why not kind of shape it more towards the actual branches of the tree itself? You know, you don't have to hit every single point, but at least make it more shaped as the natural formation of the trunk. You know, you don't need a full shape there. That's a little bit of overkill as far as line of sight goes. So that's basically some tips there to help make this so that your performance on your maps doesn't take a big hit. So I'm going to double click here, and I can use the simplify button here, and it will take out more. But if you overdo it, then you're going to lose some of your structure here. So you got to be careful. Don't overdo it. But just do it once or twice, and that should be enough. Like right here, if I do it too much, then it's going to remove some of the critical points that you have in here, like your corners and such. You don't want to do that. So just kind of use it once or twice, and that should take care of most of it. So that's just a tip to keep your maps from becoming too cumbersome and too detailed to where it's going to cause a performance hit and make things really laggy, especially when you have people connected to your table. So that's just a tool and a way to make things a little bit easier for you. The next thing I'm going to get into is actually using the map. So like this is off here. I wouldn't want this. So I would actually move this in, because that's really not going to benefit or do anything for the game. So I'm going to move that inside of the map. You don't want to run these outside if you can help it. And it's not going to kill anything, but it messes up the line of sight a little bit. And then some of the stuff here, like I want the players to be able to see the tree more. So I would move some of these points in and make this more natural looking instead of having all these different dots for every little nook and cranny. That's just way too much. This is kind of excessive, to be honest. So that's just something to keep in mind. When you're placing line of sight, you don't have to have 50,000 points. In this case, you're just trying to block off the main tree trunk and some of the major branches, and that's it. You don't need to cover the entire tree unless, like I said, it's like a bush that goes all the way to the ground. So that's just a little tip. Now, once I turn on the line of sight tool, that stuff will become more apparent. So right now, there's not any line of sight active, even though it's on there. And I think this is what most people struggle with. So when I say on there, it means that line of sight is created. So if I unlock this and go to the line of sight tool, obviously there's some elements here of line of sight. And this just happens to be terrain only, which just blocks light. That's all it does. It doesn't block movement. It more or less blocks light. So now what I'm going to do is turn on play mode. So before you use any map in Fantasy Grounds, go to play mode and take a look at this right-hand panel. Let me see if I can zoom in on this. So yeah. So here you have your actions for the map. You can show or hide shortcuts, enable or disable player vision. So that's something you want to do to check on the overall vision of your players and for you as the game master. You have to enable line of sight in order for those features to work. So I'm going to turn that on. Enabling and disabling lighting, that needs to be on too if you want to take advantage of the ambient light and token lights. And then there's the token lock, which is on by default. So if you don't want your players running around, you can turn that on or off. But by default, it's on. But if you want to turn that off, you can do it here or up here in the right corner. That will allow for your players to move freely, or if you want them to move within their movement rate and kind of keep track of that a little bit better, that's the way you can lock it. That way you have to approve the movement. Really depends on what you're doing. During combat and such, I'll have it locked. But during role-playing and exploration, I might unlock it temporarily just so they can have a little bit more freedom. But you get people that want to move all over the place and do kinds of stuff. So it's up to you if you want to go nuts or if you want to control your table or how you want to do it. And then over here, of course, are the different layers for the map. So those are all locked in and ready to go. And as you notice that this layer doesn't have a name, so I'm going to double-click on it. I'm going to call it line of sight. That way I don't accidentally delete that layer. That would be a bummer because then I'd have to redo all the line of sight. I don't want that. So this actually came with some line of sight already done. And that's why I had to go back and modify it because I thought it was a little excessive and there was too many data points. With that, having that many data points, Fantasy Grounds has to calculate that, and it really makes for a tougher way to basically to run your game. It just makes it clunkier and a lot more, how would I say, frustrating. So that's basically how the tools, you need to have those on if you're going to take advantage of line of sight and terrain and token lighting and ambient lighting. So here's a word on ambient lighting. So if you're underground, like in a dungeon, you don't normally need any sort of lighting because you're basically blocked from light. So if you go to the lighting tool and you come over here to where it says ambient lighting, if that's not enabled, it's going to be default. It's going to be pretty dark. You're not going to see anything. However, if you're outdoors, you might want to enable that. So this is a swamp, so I'm going to assume it doesn't get a ton of light. It might be filtered light. So I would probably give it a preset of either dawn or dusk, probably not full-on sun, or moonlight. So it depends on what you want to do. So moonlight would kind of brighten it up just a little bit more. So if I change this to dawn, you can see it kind of changes color. So dawn's a lot brighter. It's kind of a yellowish color. Let me get rid of the zoom. And then sunlight obviously is going to show everything. And what's happening is you'll see the shadows here. They will change according to what you're doing. So here's dawn. So that lengthens the shadow kind of because the angle of the sun. There's sunlight, which is right straight down on top of it. And then there, of course, is dusk, which is the shadows are on the other side of the tree. And then, of course, you have moonlight, which is just a really light amount of light. So I'm going to leave it on moonlight. I'm going to assume that when the players arrive, it's going to be pretty dim. And it's going to be evening time. So I'm going to have that on. And this is what the map looks like in that regard. So let me expand this a little bit so you can see what's going on here. So when you're in play mode, that is when you're actually playing. And if you want to recenter the map or make it larger, you can right-click on the map, go to View, and then change it to Zoom to Fit. And that'll actually zoom in to the actual dimensions that you have set for the map frame. So when you're playing, set the frame of where you want the map to be visible and leave it there. Don't move it around as much as possible. So this is where I want it to show up every time. So if I close this map and I need to come back to it, or if I come back from another session, I have it in my shortcuts down below at the bottom. So when I click on that, that's going to go where I left it. I don't want it to pop up some random place. I want it to go where I left it. That's something that you need to learn about Fantasy Grounds with any of these windows. So like this notes button down here, I have my notes for this tutorial. I want those to show up down here at the bottom every time. So I'm going to drag and drop the shortcut into the hotkeys below. I'm going to close the notes. When I come back to that, I want to open up the notes again, and it will bring it up where I left it. So open up the window, stretch it to where you want it, put a bookmark on it if you need to, and then close it if you need the space. Once you do that, it's going to save the dimensions and it's going to save the location. So the notes will go back up there. The swamp will go there. So that's basically a really powerful thing that you can do to make life easier on you when you're running your games or even when you're organizing your content. You want to have a way that you lay things out. And it's done ahead of time generally before your session. So that's the way I have it. And the same thing with my characters here. I'm not playing these characters, but I have to help my players when they run into problems. I need to have those accessible. So in order for me to make that easier for me, and so I don't have to keep opening and closing characters and moving them around, I'll take them, like they usually pop up here in the center, and they'll look something like this. I don't want it there. When it does that the first time, I move it over to the left. I'll stretch it and drag it to where I can see the whole character sheet, and that is where it's going to pop up again. So if I close that and I click on the right-hand side over here where the actual combat tracker is on the right, that's where the sheet will pop up. That's exactly where I want it. Same thing with these others. I've already pre-stretched these out and put them in the location I want them. So when I come back to play again, this is where they're going to pop up, not some random place that I don't know. Same thing with this character. They're all going to pop up in the same area. I don't normally have to see them side by side all at once, so I don't even need to do that. I just stack them like a deck of cards. That's basically going to save you a lot of headache and trauma. And then here I have the Actions tab available, so I don't have to constantly, look at things and stuff. Everything's right here. And if I close these or I leave Fantasy Grounds, when I come back, all I have to do is click on these little shortcut links on the right-hand side of the combat tracker. It brings them up. And then when I select the combat tracker, it is basically going to allow me to go to each character as they appear in the combat tracker. So watch Commander Cornwell here. If I click on his shortcut, that brings his sheet up. Once I click the down arrow, I just click on the right-hand side. There's Doric. I click the down arrow, click on the right-hand side, there is Hiena. So it's very simple to do it that way. It makes it easier, makes it smoother. You can locate it where you want, but have a home for it. That's kind of what I'm getting at. And that makes so much difference when you are using maps. You need this as much space as possible. So utilize it, organize it, make it to where you have a flow, some sort of feng shui here so that you're not constantly fighting the interface. That's what most people do in the beginning is they'll move windows around. They go, oh, I want this area here. Then they'll close the map. Then guess what? When you open that up, that's where it's going to go, where you left it. So leave the windows where you left them or where you want them, and then close them. And then if you need to bring them back up, you can resummon them from the hotkeys, or you can make a note and just drag them all to the note. So for instance, this note down here that I have at the bottom, I can unlock this and I can link everything to this and use this as a run list so that when I play, it's easier for me to bring up all the things I need. So I can link the map to this. I can link all the character sheets to here if I want. There's so many things you can do to make life easier on you without fighting the interface. And that's what most people do is they sit there and they fight it. They complain about it. Oh, Unity and Fantasy Grounds sucks. Well, it's because you haven't found a way to utilize the interface to your advantage. And that's kind of what I'm doing here. So now when I come back to my game and I've signed out for the day and I come back next week, all I have to do is call upon these buttons to bring everything back up. It's that simple. So if I can even take the combat tracker, that won't be open when I first start. I can drag that button into the notes. So now when I come back into this table, all I have to do is open up my notes. It'll show up where I left it, which is in this little area here. And then I'm going to click on the image for the map. Here's Watch Commander Cornwell. Here's Doric, here's Hiena, here's the combat tracker. That's simple. I don't need to have the extension that people swear by. What is the, I guess it's the location one, or I don't remember what it is. Basically, where you click on it and it brings all the windows back up. It's unnecessary. You can do that yourself. You don't need to have an extension to do that. It takes like 2 seconds to make this list and 2 seconds to click on them when you first start your table. You don't really need a Windows Saver. I think it's kind of a waste. It's basically a one click and then everything pops up at once. That could be hard on your system. So if you have a bunch of maps and such open and you click on that button and they all pop up at once, that could be a big memory spike, and I don't like that risk. I don't mind opening them up one at a time. So that's just something that, yeah, the dice tower is pretty fun. I can move that, right click on it. You can unlock it, move it. And you just drag and drop it. There you go. So these are just some quick tips for managing the table. So back to the maps. So the first thing, once you have a map set up and you have line of sight and you have the vision and all that enabled, so that would be in the play mode. So make sure that these are on. That's important. So the next thing I want to show you is a common thing that most people have problems with in the beginning. So when a game master puts a token on this combat tracker, I'm going to drag over one of the characters. I got Watch Commander Cornwell. He's a human. He doesn't have any vision. So meaning he doesn't have dark vision or any sort of light source at the moment. So I'm going to take his token on the left, drag and drop it next to the boat here on the map. So when he's on the map, when you actually have this highlighted and you go into play mode, lock this up. So when you have him on the map, he's just going to be seeing what the line of sight will reveal and the moonlight. Right now, I'm looking in the DM mode. That's why I can see everything. But if I hit Control P or I hold the control button and hit P, that's what the actual player sees. So that's moonlight right there. If you want to run this particular scenario in the view of the player, you just unlock the map, click on the Enable Party Vision, and this is or the player vision view. this will keep that on at all times so you can actually see. So when you're moving this token around, that's what they see. It's really, really, really dim. So they can still see because there's moonlight out there. Now, if you don't have that lighting on, that is not going to activate the actual lighting or the ambient light that's available. When you're underground in a cavern or a dungeon, you normally don't need that. But when you're outside and you have things such as moon and sun and stars and all that stuff, that is going to affect the map. If you have both indoor and outdoor, you're going to have to mask off the building so that the ambient light does not affect what's inside of the building. So there's a way to do that. I'm not going to cover that, but that is a consideration. Or if you're underground, maybe instead of having sunlight or moonlight, maybe there's a light green or light purple glow. You could do that for some ambient light to kind of give your map some feel. But in general, most dungeon maps do not have lighting enabled. So you're going to be basically like this. It's off or on, basically. And depending on what light sources your character has, that is going to be what they see. So without lighting, it's going to be like daylight out here. So basically, this is what the player would see. They'll still have the line of sight blocking the tree and such and the hut, but they're not going to have any penalty or any sort of influence from ambient light unless you enable lighting. Now, for line of sight, if you turn that off, you're not going to have any of the influence from light being blocked by your tool or by your line of sight. So that needs to be enabled for the walls and the terrain to work. The other confusion is when it's your turn on the combat tracker, as the game master or player, you have to have the token selected. If you click on it again, that deselects that player and you do not see in the view of that player. So if I click on it again, this is the actual view. If I deselect it, this is the overview for the game master. So keep that in mind. And if I want to turn off the player vision, this is what it looks like when it's not selected. That is what it looks like when it is selected. It's kind of hard to tell, but you got these shadows. I really think that this little point here is difficult for most people that are brand new to wrap their mind around. So as the game master, this can be confusing. So if when you deselect, you're not going to see what that player sees at all. You're going to see the overview vision of the map that you have set. If you click on a token and it's actually highlighted, you're going to see the vision or the viewpoint of that player. And you'll really see it if you put on player vision, because that's going to show their actual token vision. So this is with it selected off. That is what it looks like selected on. This is also true of NPCs. I'm going to put some on this map as well. So I have an encounter here that I created that is linked to the map. So if I pop this up, these are lizard folk. They are already pre-placed on this map. I've already went ahead and placed them in strategic places. All I have to do now is click the down arrow. That adds them to the map. So these little grayed out areas here, their faction is neutral, so they're not hostile right away. They will react accordingly, depending on how you react. And they're set there. The players can't see them yet because they're not visible on the combat tracker. The combat tracker does not change the vision. So in other words, when you switch between tokens, if the token is not selected, you're not necessarily going to change the view that you need to see in the combat tracker. It really depends on if you have this enabled, disable player vision, and what is selected. So if I select this token, I am going to see the vision if I click on the token, not if I have it selected in the combat tracker. So if I click the down arrow, it's going to this lizard folk person, but it's not changing the vision. You have to click on the token in order for the vision of that token to become apparent. This is a problem or a misunderstanding. So even if you switch to the next combatant, which is the shaman, it's not changing the vision. And I think people get that wrong. So if I truly want to see what this lizard man is looking at, I need to click on his token and select it. If you deselect it, you're not going to see through that token's eyes. So get that in your mind. The combat tracker changes tokens, but it does not activate the vision for that token unless you take ownership of it. That is something that you need to learn. That is something what most people have problems with when they're trying to use Fantasy Grounds, especially if you're new. So make sure that you understand that when you are going through and looking at the map. You have to select the token. If you click on it again, it deselects the token. Okay, so selection and deselection is determined by the game master when he is using the table. The players have their own token. They normally only have access to one token. Sometimes they might be controlling an NPC or whatever. They need to click on the actual token. The combat tracker does not switch view. It only switches the actor. It does not switch the actor's vision. So just keep that in mind. That is something that most people get wrong. And I've seen so many people go to the forums and say, well, line of sight doesn't work. Fantasy Grounds sucks. I hate it. Well, generally, what it is first of all, you don't have, or they don't have any of these things enabled. So that right there already cancels out all the line of sight, all that stuff. So you turn these on, and that activates the line of sight. But once the line of sight is active, they don't realize that if they don't have a token selected on the battle map or whatever map they're on, they're not seeing the true vision, or they're not seeing through the eyes of that actor. So you have to switch manually as the game master to know what that is. And that's just the way Fantasy Grounds works. And I don't think that's readily apparent or clear until you've used Fantasy Grounds for a little bit to get an understanding of it and to get your mind wrapped around how it works. So that is the basic thing that most people miss or they don't understand, is the token vision is different than the combat tracker selection. They are not the same thing. So just kind of keep that in mind. So I'm going to go back up to the top here in the combat tracker. Now that moves to this token, but it doesn't change the view that I have of the token unless it was already selected. So now that I have it selected, I can see through the eyes of this token. And if I truly want to see what it would look like from a player standpoint, hitting Control P gives me an idea of what they're seeing. And obviously it's not a whole lot because it doesn't. I don't think lizardmen have dark vision. So it's pretty dim for them as well. Now, if I want to run this where the token vision is on all the time, now I can see how it would appear for NPCs and players on the battle map. And then I would just have to toggle between each one to get an idea of what their vision looks like. And that's something that you got to get used to as a game master. So depending on who's selected in the combat tracker is who you might select. But then if you, let's say your next turn is Lizard Folk number 2, you might select him just to see what he has for vision. And then when you skip to his turn, you'll already have a preview of what's going on. So that's just something you got to get used to. You got to select the token, and you have to select the combatant on the combat tracker. They are independent. They don't change with each other. So if I change to this Lizard Folk 1, that doesn't change it to the combat tracker of Lizard Folk 1. I have to physically click on it to move it back. So that's what you have to do when you're using Fantasy Grounds and the combat tracker. And this is true of any rule set. Most rule sets behave this way. So whether you're doing Pathfinder or any of the other rule sets, you need to independently select a token depending on what's going on and what's going on in the combat tracker. They are not the same. They're independent. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so as a GM, you can even know what you're at. Yes, exactly. That is an important point that I'm trying to make, is you are going to assume that they can see. However, if you have obstacles in the way and you're using line of sight, they may not see what's going on. Even though you, as the game master, knows that, it'd be nice to know if this lizard man could see this other lizard man. So how would he know, unless they practice or rehearse this, how would he know which side to go on to support this lizard folk other than using hearing? So let's not forget there are other forms of senses. So this is when I talk about limitation of senses. Quite often, we get wrapped up in this line of sight, this view. Now, not everyone or everything makes decisions based on sight. This is why some creatures are nocturnal. They use radar, they use dark vision, they use sound, and they use scent. So maybe that this lizard folk person doesn't know that his ally is directly opposite of him, but he might hear that. So just having vision doesn't fix or change that much other than aiming and targeting something. So if he wanted to cast Bless on this lizard folk, he could hear him over there, but he could not see him. And a lot of spells are based on visual sight. So that is something to keep in mind as well. So remember that most creatures rely on all the senses, not just vision, like humans and regular folks do. So also, in this case, this lizard folk is probably going to focus on one of the players if he was going to attack him or watch him. And as you can see, he has this vision here. And if I turn off the token vision, it's still going to give you the overview, and you're still going to be able to see it, but it's not as apparent as when you actually turn on token vision. When you enable the player vision, it gives you that. If you hit Control P while you're in this mode, you get the DM overview. So it just depends on how you want to run your table. But that helps to understand that. This is a preview mode, but you can toggle it on or off manually, or you can temporarily just hold Control and P just to get a quick look at what that player sees. So in other words, I can run it like this. I can run it in this mode where I can see everything. And then when it comes to Lizard Folk 1's turn, such as clicking over here, when I hit Control P, this is what he truly sees. And that's just a temporary toggle. That's not permanent. So there you go. So that's basically what you want to do when you're running these campaigns, is understand where the vision is, who's got the vision, and which token is going, or what turn it is on the combat tracker. So that's the way to do it. So that's just so that you can understand how this works, because I think a lot of people are confused about that. I think they're assuming that when you select a token in the combat tracker and you click the next actor button, that it's switching the view. It's not. It's selecting the token by the turn, but it's not actually selecting for vision. So you don't have ownership of that unless you click on the token itself. So even though the combat tracker selects or highlights the next actor, that doesn't necessarily mean you have possession of it. And that's I think that's the biggest disconnect when it comes to using this actual tool. So combat tracker is not directly linked to token view. That has to be selected by the game master or the player as you use that particular NPC or player. So just remember that. If you can wrap your mind around that, it's going to get easier. The next thing I wanted to point out was the use of some functions in Fantasy Grounds can get a little confusing. So for instance, this watch commander is almost blind in this actual map here because it's outdoors, but it's at night in a swamp. So it's already kind of inherently dark. But if you're in the Underdark or in a dungeon that has no light source whatsoever, this is what you're going to see as the player. So let me go back to the lighting, go back to the ambient lighting, and I'm going to turn off any sort of ambient lighting. So when you select this token and you're in play mode, that's deselecting the token. That is selecting. There's hardly anything. The only thing he has is a little bit of muscle memory from when he was able to see. You can see a little bit of stuff around here, but it's almost pitch black. So in this case, he cannot rely on moonlight or sunlight. He needs either an artificial light source or magic. So that is achieved by either the game master, who says, well, if you have a torch, go ahead and light it up, or activate it. So if it's his turn, so I'm going to actually advance the turn to Watch Commander. So Watch Commander, if I bring up his sheet, he does have some torches. It has the effect here for the lighting. So if I turn this on, it will light up the map. If I drag this to the token and I have line of sight on and I have everything correct, but this one isn't actually coded. This is the older one that actually it does not have the lighting coded, but if you have a newer version of either Rob Tui's coding effects or the others that are out there, the lighting is normally built in, or it might be built into the actual item that's on the sheet. However, Fantasy Grounds does not inherently come that way. You have to apply it yourself, and that can be done fairly simply in the interface. So if he needs a torch and you don't have it coded on the sheet, you can come up here to the top right under Effects, and here are some presets. And all you have to do is say, okay, you're using one of your torches, so we're going to check that off on his sheet if you're tracking it. Or go to his inventory, make sure that he actually has it in his possession. Normally, you're not tracking how many they have, just that they have it. And then you would take this effect, which in this case is torch, and you could drag and drop it onto that token, and that's what's going to allow for him to have the vision that he needs based off the type of lighting that he has in his possession. The only thing about having the GM do this is that you are going to have to probably remove this. So if he puts the torch out or he drops it or whatever, you're going to have to manage that as a game master. So you do that by removing it from the combat tracker. Now, if the player puts that effect on him through his character sheet instead of through the interface, he can very easily go through and remove that effect from. So that puts more responsibility on the players and less on you. So that is something you can do. So if you go to the Actions tab on any given character sheet and you create the action of actually having a torch or some sort of light source, you can create that. So right now this coding here is set up for the older system. But if you turn on the secondary effect, which is part of this, so this bottom one is kind of useless. This only has a note on here, which is the old way to report that you were actually using a torch, and then it would track the time. So that is actually redundant. You don't really even need that. That's more or less a note. And that's the old way to do this. So the newer way would be to create a torch and then actually add the coding to it. So that had the coding in there. I actually removed it. But if you go to one of the, in this case, this would be for spells, you can drag and drop a torch onto that character and it would turn on the line of sight and it would be assigned to that character and they can remove it and add it themselves. So that way you're not stuck doing that for everybody. You already have to manage the NPCs. So if this lizard man needs to have a torch, you are going to have to add that yourself. And that would be done in the effects area. So if he had a lamp or a lantern, let's say a lantern, you would drag and drop that either onto the token or the combat tracker entry. So in this case, this lamp is going to be the lizardman shaman's job to illuminate the area. He's also standing up on top of the doorway or the ledge on the rooftop. So he's actually probably about 15-20 feet above the characters. So that is something that you need to get used to coordinating. It's either you put the onus on the players or you put the effect on them manually through the interface. Either way,